The Mad Scientist Club by Bertrand R. Brindley, illustrated by Charles Gear. These stories are dedicated to all boys who like to dream about things they would like to do, and to my agent Carl Brandt, without whose constant prodding I probably never would have written them. The Strange Sea Monster of Strawberry Lake. Dinky Poor didn't really mean to start the story about the huge sea monster in Strawberry Lake. He was only telling a fib because he had to have an excuse for getting home late for supper. So, he told his folks he'd been running around the lake trying to get a close look at a huge, snake-like thing he'd seen in the water, and the first thing he knew, he was too far from home to get back in time. His mother and father greeted this tale with some skepticism, but Dinky's two sisters were more impressionable, and that's how the story really got out. They kept pestering him for so many details about the monster that he had to invent a fantastic tale to satisfy them. That's one of the troubles with a lie. You've got to keep adding to it to make it believable to people. It didn't take long for the story to get around town, and pretty soon Dinky Poor was a celebrity in Mammoth Falls. He even had his picture in the paper, together with an artist's conception of the thing he had seen. It was gruesome looking, something like a dinosaur, but with a scaly, saw-toothed back like a dragon. Dinky was never short on imagination. He was able to give the artist plenty of details. It was the artist's sketch in the newspaper that got Henry Mulligan all excited. Henry is the first vice president and also chief of research for the Mad Scientist Club and is noted for his brainstorms. Neither Henry nor anyone else in the club actually believed Dinky had seen a real monster, but we were all willing to play along with a gag, especially when Henry suggested we could build a monster just like the one shown in the paper. Build a monster? Freddie Muldoon's round face was all googly-eyed. He liked the idea, but he just didn't know how Henry proposed going about it. He rubbed his button nose, which was almost itching. He asked, "You mean a real monster that can swim?" "Don't be a dope," said Dinky. "I'm not a dope, but who ever heard of a monster that can't swim?" "The one we build will float," said Henry, rubbing his chin and looking up at the rafters at the club laboratory the way he always did when he was speculating on a new project. "All we need is some canvas and chicken wire and Jeff Crocker's canoe." Jeff Crocker is the president of our club, mainly because his father owns the barn that we have our lab in, but also because he's just as smart as Henry and maybe a little more scientific. Henry dreams up most of the schemes that we get messed up in, but it is usually Jeff who figures out how to do everything, or how to get us out of whatever we got into. Since Henry's plan to build a lake monster seemed like a good one, we held a formal meeting of the club that night to take vote on it. Naturally, we all voted in favor of it, and 3 days later we had most of it finished. We built it on a small piece of dry land hidden away back in the swampy end of the lake. Henry and Jeff had designed a frame of light lumber and lafts that had the shape of a big land lizard, and we suspended this across the gunwales of the canoe. Then we hung chicken wire on the frame and stretched canvas over it. With a little paint and a few shiny tin can lids spotted here and there, we soon had a loathsome-looking creature, guaranteed to scare the life out of anyone 100 yards away from it. Jeff had to keep putting the brakes on Henry's fancy ideas, but he did let him outfit the head with a pair of red eyes, which were just flashlights with red lenses stuck out through the canvas. Henry installed a switch and circuit breaker in the canoe so that the eyes could be made to blink. After 2 days of practice back in the swamps, we figured we could handle the beast well enough to make a test run out on the lake. The monster's profile stuck up about 4 feet out of the water, and it was a cinch for 4 of us to sit upright in the canoe to do the paddling and steering. Meanwhile, the town was still all excited about the possibility that there was a real, live sea monster in Strawberry Lake. A reporter from one of the big city papers had been in town to interview Dinky Poor, and when folks heard this, a lot of them began to recall seeing strange things on the water. Everybody wanted to get into the act, and pretty soon all sorts of people were volunteering information. Daphne Muldoon got her picture on the front page, not because she had seen the monster, but because she lived in Mammoth Falls and had a good-looking face and pretty legs. Daphne is one of Freddie Muldoon's cousins. Her younger brother, Harmon, used to be a member of our club, but he got kicked out for conduct unbecoming a scientist and for giving away secret information. The first night we took the beast out was a Saturday, when the lake cabins and beachfront were crowded with weekend visitors. We figured it was best to wait until just before dark. Then people couldn't see too well, and there were fewer boats on the lake. There are plenty of small islands near the swampy end of Strawberry Lake, and this gave us a good chance to get the monster out into open water for a short run and then scoot it back into the cover of the swamp before anyone could discover where it had gone. Homer Snodgrass, who was one of the brighter members of our club, had agreed to sit on the front porch of his folks' cabin so that we could get a first-hand report on what the monster looked like from the shore. Jeff and I were sitting in the middle of the canoe and doing the paddling. Mortimer Dalrymple, our electronics wizard, was steering, and Henry sat up in the prow, where he could look out through the peepholes. "Are there many people on the beach?" Jeff asked. "Scads of them," said Henry. "It's still light enough to see pretty well, but I don't think anybody has sighted us yet." It was dark as black velvet inside the monster, though, and there was damp, musty odor of canvas and paint. It was a little like being in the tunnel of love at an amusement park. I started to giggle, and Jeff told me to shut up or I might spoil everything. But I think he wanted to giggle too, and was afraid I might start him off. "Don't get all shook up," came Mortimer's quiet voice from somewhere in the darkness back toward the monster's tail. Mortimer is always quiet like that. He never gets excited about anything. "It's half a mile over to the beach. They can't hear us unless we make a real big noise," he pointed out. Suddenly, Henry jumped violently, bumping his head on the framework of the beast's spine and rocking canoe. "They've seen us!" he cried. "They've seen us!" "What? How do you know?" asked Jeff in a whisper. "There's a bunch of them running out to the end of the boat dock. They're jumping up and down and pointing out here and waving and screaming." Henry was right. We could hear some shouting now, and a few shrill screams of women. "Let's rock the boat some," Mortimer shouted from the back. "Give 'em a good show." He was excited too, for once. "I can't see anything now," Henry cried. "My glasses are all wet." We could hear Henry moving around up front as Mortimer started rocking the canoe from the rear and swishing the beast's huge tail back and forth through the water. Suddenly, there was a splash and a gurgle, and my paddle hit something heavy and soft. Then there was a glurping noise, and something grabbed my paddle and tried to pull it out of my hands. There was a lot of thrashing going on, and I got scared and started hollering at Jeff to help me. The canoe and the whole framework of the monster were rocking violently. "Maybe we've run into a real monster," Mortimer snickered. "Shut up and stop rocking," Jeff shouted. "Where's Henry?" Just then, Henry's head appeared right beside me, and one of his hands grasped the gunwale of the canoe. "Lord," he said, "my glasses, I lost them." By this time, Mortimer had stopped rocking, and we managed to pull Henry back into the canoe. "Get up front and see where we are," Jeff commanded, shoving me by the shoulder. "We've got to get this monster out of here before somebody starts chasing us in a motorboat. Henry, what were you doing in the water anyway?" Henry was choking on lake water and didn't bother to answer. When we got back into town that night, we stopped in for Coke and ice cream at Martin's ice cream parlor, where Homer had agreed to meet us. The whole town was buzzing. Everybody in Martin's was talking about the sea monster and about how Dinky Poor had been right after all. We took a booth in a corner where nobody could overhear us and listened to Homer's report. There was no doubt the beast had been a sensational success. Homer said it had almost rolled over once and all the women on the beach had screamed. When Homer left the beach, state police cars had arrived and were sweeping the lake with their spotlights, but they didn't see anything, of course. We took the monster out a couple more times that week and got to be pretty expert at handling her. The town just about went wild. The newspaper offered $100 as a prize to anyone who could get a picture of the beast, and people started flocking into Mammoth Falls from all over the state, hoping to get a look at it. Lake cabins were renting for as high as $200 apiece, when they used to bring $50 a week, and a lot of local families just moved back into town and rented their cabins out to sightseers. All the concessions at the beach were doing a booming business, and the restaurants and the one hotel in town couldn't handle the crowds. Homer's father, who runs a hardware store, said he'd never seen such business. Pretty soon, we realized we had a tiger by the tail. Business was so good, and people in town were so happy, that we didn't dare stop taking the monster out, even though it was wearing us down. We soon had something worse to worry about, however. Homer Snodgrass came running over to my house after lunch one day, all breathless. "Guess what?" said Homer. "Guess what?" I asked. "Give the club code word," he said. "Skinamaru," I said. "The information you are about to receive is classified confidential," Homer panted. "You swear not to tell anyone not a member of the Mad Scientist Club." "I swear." Then Homer told me that Harmon Muldoon had been in his father's store with two men. They wanted ammunition for an elephant gun. Mr. Snodgrass doesn't carry that kind of ammunition, of course, but he did tell them where they could order it in Chicago. The two men were from out of town, and they said Harmon had promised to show them an island on the lake where they could set up a campsite and try to get a good shot at the monster when it came out in the evening. They decided to drive to Chicago to pick up the ammunition. This news called for an emergency meeting of the club and executive session, and we held it that night in Jeff's barn. Everyone agreed that we couldn't take the beast out again and risk being shot through the head with an elephant gun. But Homer argued that we couldn't disappoint all the merchants and other people in town who were making money on the tourists. Dinky Poor, as usual, was in favor of writing a letter to the president and asking for his help. While we were arguing, Henry Mulligan suddenly turned his eyes up toward the rafters and started stroking his chin. Whenever this happens, everybody stops talking and waits for Henry to speak. After a decent interval of respectful silence, Henry brought his eyes down and fixed them on Jeff. "Your father has a small outboard motor that can be mounted on the canoe, hasn't he?" "Sure," said Jeff. "We use it for fishing at the shallow end of the lake. And it's a pretty quiet one, as I remember. It doesn't even scare the fish." "Okay," said Henry. "Now, if Homer can bamboozle his father out of a few essential pieces of hardware, I think we have enough equipment here in the lab to rig that motor up so that it can be controlled by radio. Then all we have to do is pick a good spot on the shore for our transmitters, on one of those steep hills on the north side, and we can make the beast do anything we want it to. And those hunters can shoot at it all they want, and they won't do anything more than put a few holes in the canvas," observed Mortimer. "Jeepers," said Dinky. "I bet that'll make Harmon mad." In about a week, we had most of the club's radio gear rigged up in the canoe so that we could make Jeff's outboard motor speed up, slow down, idle, turn right, or turn left, and reverse itself. We made a few short test runs with it way back in the swamp end of the lake, and everything worked fine. This time, Jeff agreed to letting Henry add a pump that would squirt water out of the beast's nostrils. And he even gave in to another of Henry's brainstorms. Freddy could make a bellow that sounded like a bull moose on a rampage because his voice was beginning to change. So, Henry figured it would be a good idea to install a loudspeaker in the belly of the monster and let Freddy bellow into a microphone once in a while from the place where he hid the transmitting equipment. The first trip of the motorized monster was sensation. Homer and Dinky and I couldn't see much of it, because it was our job to go back in the swamp, get the beast from its hiding place, and start the motor. Then we called Jeff on our walkie-talkie, and he directed the operation from the wooded hill where he had our transmitting apparatus. Henry and Mortimer operated the radio controls to steer the beast and make the eyes blink and nostrils spout water. Freddy stood by to bellow whenever Jeff tapped him on the shoulder. Jeff watched the monster all the time through binoculars. She moved through the water much faster now, and every time Freddy let out one of those bull moose call, it echoed back and forth among the hills and caused a regular panic on the beach. We got her back into the protection of the swamp just before dark, all right, but we had some anxious moments when she passed the last island out in open water. 4 or 5 shots were fired at her, and Jeff said he could see the bullets splashing in the water. But the beast kept on moving as though nothing had happened, and this must have caused Harmon's hunter friends some consternation. The next day, every newspaper in the country must have carried the story. They quoted eyewitnesses who swore that the monster was mad about something because it was swimming a lot faster and making a frightening noise. A scientist in New York speculated that it might be the mating season for the beast, and suggested the possibility that there might actually be 2 of them. Within 3 days, there must have been 150 reporters in Mammoth Falls from newspapers, magazines, radio, and television stations. Newsreel camera crews were lined up along the beach, and several of them had large searchlights ready to sweep across the surface of the lake at dusk, when the monster usually appeared. We kept the beast under wraps for a few days, and spent the time visiting with the camera crews and reporters. Most of them were camped on the beach, sleeping in cars and station wagons, because there weren't any rooms available in town. Besides, getting a good line on what the reporters were planning to do, we were able to make a little money for the club treasury by running errands for them and operating a lemonade stand. Hot dogs were selling for 30 cents a piece at the beach, and for 15 cents in town. We did a pretty good business buying them at Martin's ice cream parlor and running them out to the beach in thermos jugs on our bicycles. Freddie Muldoon was able to get $5 for an old telescope he bought for $1.95 through a magazine ad, and Henry traded some of his father's shaving cream for flash bulbs and camera film. We kept Dinky Poor's mother pretty busy baking cakes and pies, but we didn't make much money on this venture because Dinky and Freddie would eat up most of the profit. They also drank too much lemonade, and after the first day, Jeff wouldn't let them run the stand anymore. By this time, several of the reporters had made camp on the same island the hunters had been on and rented some high-powered motorboats. They were determined to get close enough to the monster to get some good pictures. There were also a lot of people tramping around the shore every day, trying to get back into the swampy end of the lake, so we decided to move the beast to a new hiding place. We picked out a deep cove studded with rocks and small islands, about 2 miles east of the swamp. Late at night, long after the searchlights had been turned off and people had gone to sleep, we towed the monster over there with a rowboat. Early the next morning, before the sun had come up, we took her out for a brief appearance on the lake and caught everybody by surprise. Some early morning watchers on the beach started shouting, and this woke up a few of the reporters on the island. But the monster was not where they had expected her to be, and by the time some of them had scrambled into their boats, we had her back in the cove and covered up among a jumble of rocks. This created quite a lot of confusion, and people began to believe the professor, who had claimed there might be 2 monsters. But we could see that the string was running out for us. There were so many people exploring the lake now, and so many scientific expeditions on their way to investigate the phenomenon, as they called it, that we were pretty sure someone would discover a hiding place sooner or later. Even though most people were too scared to take boats out anymore, there were several boats making regular patrols of the lake, and every once in a while a helicopter would fly over it. We held a meeting to discuss the situation. Dinky Poor argued that Abraham Lincoln said you couldn't fool all of the people all of the time, and we might as well quit while we were ahead and claim the $100 reward the newspaper is offering. But Henry claimed that P.T. Barnum had proved Lincoln was wrong, and so had a lot of politicians. Homer Snodgrass was in favor of continuing as long as we could, because all the extra tourist business was good for the town, and Mammoth Falls had always been a pretty poor place. But Mortimer and Jeff and I were beginning to feel that we should confess the whole business to Mayor Scragg, because he was getting worried about the monster making the lake unsafe for boating and swimming. We also felt that Harmon Muldoon would get wise to us pretty soon and spill the beans. We had seen him sneaking around the lab a lot lately, trying to follow us sometimes. We knew Harmon was a pretty bright boy. He had been our radio expert when he was in the club, and he had enough brains to figure out the whole deal eventually. Freddie wasn't around when the meeting started, but he came busting in now, all out of breath after running all the way from the house. "The jig is up, fellas," he announced. "I think Harmon has snitched on us." We all started questioning Freddie at once, of course, and Jeff had to rap for order so that he could get the story straight. It seems that Harmon had been up early in the morning, fiddling with his ham radio outfit, and had picked up Freddie's bellow coming over the air. He recognized it as a sound the monster made, and he knew that it couldn't get on the air unless the monster was sitting next to a microphone. "Holy smoke," said Mortimer, slapping himself on the forehead. "We should have had brains enough to change all our frequencies after Harmon left the club. He knows which ones we use." Freddie explained that Harmon had then gone to the local newspaper and told a reporter what he had suspected, in hopes of claiming the reward. The editors didn't intend to print this story until they had more proof, but they were certainly going to investigate this theory. Freddie got all this information from his father, who works in the composing room. It didn't take us long to make a decision after getting this news. Mortimer had made good friends with one of the out-of-town reporters on the beach. His name was Bud Stewart, and he wrote for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, which we knew was a big newspaper. So Jeff and Mortimer went to see him and told him the story after he had agreed to a proposition. He got his home office to agree to buy the club an oscilloscope and a 10-channel transmitter for a lab in return for exclusive pictures of the monster. Then we all sat down with Mr. Stewart and mapped out a plan of action. Early the next morning, we took him to our hiding place and uncovered the monster for him so that he could get pictures of it. He also wanted to get some pictures of the beast in action, of course, so we planned to take it out for an excursion that very night. We figured that if we waited any longer, Harmon Muldoon would have time to show the local newspaper people how to get a fix on the location of our transmitters by tuning in our frequency from 2 or 3 different places. Mr. Stewart went out to the airport to hire a helicopter. He planned to fly over the lake just before dusk, and when we saw him, we were to unleash the beast. That night, we were all in our positions early, just in case Mr. Stewart misjudged the time. It seemed like a long wait, but he finally appeared and waved to us from the helicopter. We had the beast all ready and started her out in the open water. Those of us who had to stay back in the cove couldn't see what happened next, but we could tell, from all the shouts and the way the helicopter was flying, that this was the monster's most triumphant appearance. We got all the details later, including a look at Mr. Stewart's pictures. The reporters who were camped out on the island were ready for us this time, and 3 boatloads of them appeared as soon as the monster got out there. They had newsreel cameras mounted on the boats, and they were only about half a mile away from the beast when Jeff gave the order to head her back to the cove. But Henry couldn't make her do a tight enough turn, and she started back on the far side of a large island and lay across the mouth of the cove. This island is a huge granite mountaintop that rises up out of the water as high as 100 feet in some places. Once the beast got behind this mass, Henry lost contact with her, and for a few moments she was running free. For some reason, the monster doubled back on its tracks, and to everyone's amazement, shot out from behind the island again, heading straight for the boats of the pursuing cameramen. Incredibly, the beast suddenly gained speed and went roaring full throttle at the tiny boats, now less than a quarter of a mile away. The newspapermen in the boats had been busy signaling the crewmen on the shore to turn on the big searchlights. They didn't notice that the monster had reversed its course until it had closed almost half the gap between them. When they did turn to see it bearing down on them, with nostrils spouting spray and red eyes blinking, panic broke loose among them. All 3 boats suddenly turned to head back for the safety of the beach. One of them nearly collided with another and had to turn so sharply that it capsized, spilling its occupants and its gear into the lake. There had been 5 men on the boat, and when they rose to the surface, they swam frantically for the nearest island. Henry and Mortimer, meanwhile, were pushing buttons and flipping switches so fast that the 2 of them looked like a centipede with a case of poison ivy. But no matter what they did, they couldn't regain control of the beast. Suddenly, Mortimer shouted, "Harmon Muldoon must be transmitting on our frequency, and he's got a stronger signal than we have. He's got the thing jammed at full throttle. Cut the receiver, Henry!" Henry threw the emergency switch that cut off the power supply to the main receiver inside the beast. She slowed down so suddenly that the head almost went under the water. Freddy was so excited that he gave out with a big hooray that sounded like the battle cry of a raging bull elephant. You could hear the screams of the people on the beach as they heard it come out of the loudspeaker. "Switch to the alternate receiver now," cried Mortimer, and Henry did so. This one operated on a different frequency, and Mortimer had insisted on installing it in case something went wrong with the main one. Since Harmon Muldoon couldn't know we were changing frequencies, it was not very likely he could jam this one too. The beast started back toward the cove, like a docile cow coming home for supper, and the searchlights on the beach finally came on. But all that the watchers on the shore could see was the tail of the beast disappearing into the darkness. It was about 2 hours later that we met Mr. Stewart at Martin's ice cream parlor to discuss what we should do next. The local radio station had just announced that Mayor Scragg had asked the governor to get the Navy to fire depth charges in the lake in hope of killing the monster. The reporters and cameramen stranded on the little island had been rescued by a police launch, but they were mad as wet hens and had apparently convinced the mayor that the beast was a menace to public health and safety. We went back out to the lake that night and stripped all our equipment out of the beast, including Jeff Crocker's canoe. We mounted her frame on an old raft that someone had abandoned on the shore. Then we towed her far enough out in the lake so that she would be visible from the shore in the morning, and anchored her there. We hung a wreath of pine cones on her neck, and Henry and Mortimer rigged up some kind of diabolical device inside her. As soon as it was light in the morning, we all climbed up to the place on the hillside where our transmitters were located. We could see a few people on the beach looking at the beast through binoculars, but nobody was taking any boats out. When the sun started to peep over the ridge on the east end of the lake, Henry pushed a button, and a lot of smoke came billowing out of the monster. All of a sudden, she burst into flames that climbed about 30 feet high, and a big column of black smoke went up in the sky. When the smoke had cleared away, there was nothing left on the lake but a dirty smear of oil and a few pieces of black debris. And that was the last that anyone ever saw of the strange sea monster of Strawberry Lake. We packed up our gear and started for home. And Dinky Poor, who was the youngest member of the Mad Scientist Club, started to cry a little bit as we were trudging through the woods. Since the sea monster had really been his idea in the beginning, I guess he felt as though he had lost a close relative. But Jeff told him he could have 2 votes for the next time the club had a meeting, and he had stopped blubbering by the time we got home.